Good evening, comrades. Welcome to this evening's Labour Left Alliance educational meeting. And it's the first of two sessions on debating Stalinism, the revolution betrayed. And we're very lucky this evening to have comrade Hillel Tickin with us, who's written and researched extensively on this topic. And indeed, as a student, I remember hearing him say, actually had studied in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. So he's not only working from a very strong theoretical background, but also experience of life in the Soviet system as it then was. I don't think I really need to introduce the seriousness of this topic and the importance of it for all left-wingers. The question of the Soviet Union has been an absolutely paramount one for much of the 20th century. Where you stood on the Soviet Union, how you understood the Soviet Union, and indeed how in the years that followed its collapse or its breakdown, decline, or whatever way we want to phrase it, how you explain that. And although for many people it's now an historical question, or as some comrades on the left said, well, once the Soviet Union goes, the way is cleared for real socialist politics, we know that that really hasn't been the case, and that even for many of us who were very critical of the Soviet system, that in a sense it's cast a very long shadow. So there's plenty to discuss, and we've got two sessions to do that. So that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Hillel. Before we do that, though, just a reminder of the format. Hillel will speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll throw it open to questions and comments. If comrades want to speak, could you please use the raise hand section, or if that's you're not able to do that, then you put it in the question and answer panel. Please don't use the chat for questions, because it's very difficult for me and for the technical comrades to sort of quite keep up with that. So just use the raise hand or the question and answer box. Okay, Hillel, over to you now.
Thank you. Well, I've been asked to discuss the Soviet Union in the period after 1924 or so. And this is in relation to Stalinism. Stalinism itself, its form and its theory, which really isn't a theory, but a series of statements, a series of actions, a very poor theory, if one has to use the word theory, is worth looking at precisely because of what happened in the Soviet Union, but really because it's had a much greater influence, obviously on China, but and one or two other countries, but in general on the left throughout the world. Most people probably who join a left-wing organization come into contact with various aspects of Stalinism, much less today, of course, with the end of the Soviet Union. But people did, and certain statements in relation to socialism were directly taken from Stalinism and often don't have anything to do with genuine Marxism. The point is that Stalinism itself can only be called a deviation. It was really turning Marxism on its head, a method of curing people of Marxism, a method of destroying Marxism. It's not that it was thought out, it couldn't be. And in no sense is the kind of Marxism which came into existence after 1924 in the Soviet Union, right down to the end, it isn't, in other words, a genuine Marxism, or worse. Someone will actually had to pass exams in that in Moscow with people who were examining me. It was absolutely clear. And nobody really bothered to deny it. They, of course, said that this is genuine Marxism, but that they believed it is another question. Anyway, what I'm going to do in this brief period is refer to critical turning points and critical forms which came into existence after the death of Lenin, which I've been asked to talk from 1924 to the end of the 30s, effectively, that period. In this period, you have the most horrific forms come into existence. The destruction of any fact of Marxism itself in this period, but also the destruction of millions of people. In 1923, the Communist Party was in considerable trouble. It had taken power. It had gone on a program of nationalization, and it had denationalized the agriculture and the industry which had been nationalized, big small-scale industry. Small to medium-sized industry was denationalized, as it had since it had been taken over in the period from November 1917 to 1921. The discussions, therefore, in 1923 were around that precise topic of where they were going to go industrially and in farming. Stalin took a line which he proceeded to reverse a few years later, but he took the line of supporting farming rather than industry. The issue was that Russia itself, the Soviet Union, was a very backward country, backward in economic terms. And they had been through a devastating war. At least 7 million people were killed. And there was considerable level of destruction. But in any case, it was relatively backward, very backward in relation to Western Europe. And in order to survive, in order to develop, in order to help the left and the West, it had to invest in order to obtain a reasonable standard of living. In 1923, there was a debate as to whether they were to invest in industry and develop industry, which, of course, as Trotsky had argued, and what became known as Trotsky has argued, they needed to do this in order, in the medium to long term, to raise the overall standard of living, which, of course, any sensible person would have thought anyway. Stalin, in supporting the peasantry, as it were, although in the medium to long term they didn't support the peasantry, Stalin had stood for concessions to the peasantry. Now, this is after the war, which ended in 1921, so it was a direct concession to the peasantry. In the context of the Soviet Union of the time, it was a move against the left. I'm stressing that because most people don't realize that that is the way it actually went. The problem was that once he'd done that, Stalin had done that, they were in a hole because what they got from industry just wasn't enough. And the peasantry were not getting an adequate return. The West, the capitalist class, did not want to finance, of course, the Soviet Union, and preferred rather to boycott it and maintain that boycott to the end, it has to be said. Now, the result was that there were progressive boycotts by the peasantry of the towns. That's to say, they didn't supply enough food. And effectively, the peasantry, who constituted 80% of the population anyway, were demanding a higher standard of living, which there was no way that the regime could give it, whether it was right-wing or left-wing. The discussion of 1923 was was correct on the side, was such that Trotsky was, and the Trotskyists or the left opposition were undoubtedly correct. So they weren't able to supply the food to the towns. And things just went from bad to worse from 1923, 24 onwards. Finally, leading to the collectivization of agriculture. Now, if one looks at Stalinism, that is a typical example of how it operated. Its understanding of society itself was poor. If you look at the book so-called produced by Stalin in the late 1930s, what is written there is unbelievable rubbish. To think that the Stalinists genuinely understood where they were going is to make a mistake. This isn't to say that there weren't intelligent people who went along with them, simply because they were opportunists, or alternatively, they weren't opportunists, but they had no choice. So, in this period, the left and right fought it out. And again, what one sees here is that in 1923, because one has to go to 1923 to explain what happened in 24, in January 24, Lenin died. In 1923, Lenin had been very ill in any case. And consequently, the Communist Party divided in the way I've just explained, with Trotsky and the left opposition arguing for growth of industry. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who were not Stalinists, they were lovers of Stalin, but very weak-minded people, or whatever one wants to call them. In 1935, Zinoviev was actually arrested by the Stalinist regime, really by Stalin himself, no doubt, and pretty well intellectually collapsed in front of the Stalinists. And Zinoviev and Kamenev typically were very weak in relation to what ought to be done, or what has to be done, or what could be done. And at first they supported Stalin. They reversed this line after 24. Didn't do them much good, though. They were loyal to the party to which they had belonged before 1917, unlike Trotsky. Trotsky, after all, only joined in 1917 itself. And of course, the term socialism in one country was actually denounced, opposed in August 1917 by the Communist Party itself. But in this period of 1924, Stalin discovered the merits of socialism in one country. As a term, it has become the standard, whatever one wants to call it, of Stalinism. And it is typical of the way it acted, by Stalinism itself acted. In a sense, Stalinism can be separated from its inventors. Obviously, Stalin didn't go around declaring himself a Stalinist all the time, and didn't require the term to be used. But in fact, it has become a very important term, I think, for the left in general, because what it represents is a form of defeat of socialism, a form by which socialism can be avoided or contained. And it represents, in many respects, a denigration of Marxism itself. Anyway, Zinoviev and Kamenev did join up to a point with Trotsky. But Trotsky did not organize on any kind of tremendous scale. The left opposition, which forms in this period, forms in 23 onwards, was very limited in its action. When Antonov Ovsienko in 1923 offered Trotsky, because Antonov Ovsienko had one of the top roles in the Soviet army, he offered a coup d'etat to Trotsky. Trotsky turned it down. Now, this was real. Antonov Ovsienko was a genuine Marxist, principled Marxist, who had offered it not because he loved Trotsky, as it were, but because it was a way out of what was already becoming clearer as to the isolation of the Soviet Union and the poverty to a considerable degree of the Communist Party as it was forming in this period, because Stalin had opened up the party and recruited all sorts of people, obviously, who had joined the Communist Party simply because it was in power. Consequently, in this period, 1924 and 1929, you have a problem of the supply of food. You have the problem that the peasantry are standing against the government effectively. And each year, over this whole period, there was a constant battle, which the leadership of the Communist Party had with most of the population. In 1927, of course, the Central Committee, the Politburo, and the Politburo of the Communist Party met, and Trotsky stood out very clearly. I think at one point he was so bored he just read a book while they were having discussions. It was pretty hopeless in relation to a considerable number of the members who'd been elected to the leadership of the Communist Party. I think many of them were intimidated. To take seriously the debate is to be idiotic. Stalin and Stalin had simply decided to take power. The people who went along with Stalin, in a sense, weren't as bad as Stalin, because as far as one could see, he was extremely limited as a human being and without any kind of barriers as to how to act. Now, one could argue, talking of Stalin himself, one could argue that Stalin became the personality that we know, and that he wasn't like that earlier. I don't know. But the fact was that he developed in this period into an increasingly wild controller of the Communist Party and of the country. Well, in this period, of course, the Communist Party itself was in considerable trouble. It didn't know where to go and didn't really know how to go. And the conclusion that they came to, therefore, was to take over the farms, so producing kolkhozing and sovkhozing. The result was, of course, a battle that's lasted a few years. I think in Ukraine, it's reckoned something like 8 million people died. The Communist Party itself was obviously second to Stalin, but as far as one can gather from the reports, the discussions, and so forth, there were discussions within it which were critical up to a point. And it's even said that Stalin withdrew for a time during the 30s. Well, this is a period of warfare, effectively, internal warfare. And it was quite clear that the Communist Party was in considerable trouble. And those who were genuine socialists and communists could obviously see this, but quite a few of them, and in fact, one could say, all genuine socialists, Marxists, were intimidated and were lucky not to be jailed. Trotskyists in general, those who proclaimed that they were such, were in fact jailed and killed. The attempt to go for industrialization, which was then proclaimed a wonderful success, was really the only way out that they had. It wasn't the only way out, as I pointed out at the beginning, in 1923, but in the way that the Communist Party and the Stalinists had organized things, it had become the only way out. That's to say, control over the process of agriculture. And at the same time, then going for a period of mass industrialization. The problem, I'll get on to 1934 and the 17th Party Congress, because it's crucial. However, before that, I have to make a couple of points which I'll take a bit further. And that is that it is was and is in the nature of Stalinism that it necessarily produces a form which is inefficient in industry, agriculture, or in the society itself. It is less efficient than capitalism itself. necessarily so. You would expect it to be so, because at least in capitalism, there's an attempt to get people either interested in their jobs or interested in the money which they receive for it. There's an elaborate system effectively within capitalism of ensuring that there's an incentive to actually work at some level. As capitalism has developed, of course, and people get adequate salaries, they become more able to control what they're doing and they're not doing, and consequently to be able to, let's say in capitalism, and consequently they're able to work less time, let's say, or else they're able to find a job which is less uninteresting or which is more controlling or whatever. They're up to a point. But it remains the case within capitalism, most of the jobs are ones that people take simply in order to survive, not because they enjoy, unlike what it would be under socialism. But even the form under capitalism was better than what existed under Stalin. That's to say, nobody had any, very few, let's say, apart from highly skilled workers or intellectuals, if they had a sufficiently abstract job, like a physicist, let's say, working in a physics lab with perhaps in order to produce an atomic bomb or whatever it would be, could enjoy the job. But most people in Soviet society would be doing the usual run of jobs in which they were not at all interested. And that happened immediately within the system. There was no incentive which really worked. Obviously, if you don't have a sufficient reward, and the system didn't have a sufficient reward really at any time for the majority of the population, then people are not going to be interested in working. More than that, what they'll do their best is to work as easily, or you could even say as badly as possible. The result was that industry was built. There's no question about it, and that substantial industry was built. But it was far more costly than what it would have cost had it been in the West. And a considerable amount of the industry was so poor that it had to be remade or destroyed. So that was true throughout this period in which the Soviet Union existed. They simply could not have a genuine incentive system which would work for most jobs. That was in its nature. That could not be changed. That was the nature of Stalinism itself. In this period, I'm finishing in about 5 minutes. In this period, and I'll discuss next time the question of what kind of industry it actually was. But in the 30s, there was the 3 5-year plans beginning in 79. Sorry, in 39. The third 5-year plan fell under the war. And it's true, they did take advantage of what was called planning. But in my view, this wasn't planning. It was a series of instructions in which they hoped those who received the instructions would be able to carry them out. They had to be altered, re-altered, changed, or whatever word you want. consequently, the Soviet Union was built in this period. Well, Russia became increasingly industrialized, not that it was industrialized, but it was increasingly industrialized this period as the industry was built up. There's no question about it. And they were able to then build the necessary dams and the other forms which are necessary both for industry and for agriculture. But they were very much lower quality than was required and took far longer. In the difficulties of which I'm really summarizing very quickly did lead to the 1934 17th Party Congress. Now, I'm not certain whether all the details have really been recovered, but as I understand it, present at the Congress were actually a number of people who were in genuine opposition, like Priebus. Priebus had been one of the three secretaries of the party in 1920, and he had written substantially. He'd become the head of the Marxism school, I forgot the name, in the early 20s. His book is translated, one of his books is translated into English, and of course, it's really a crucial book to read. Priebus was one of the formal Trotskyists down to 1927, when the Trotskyists were expelled, and Trotsky himself was forced to go to Alma Ata. Priebus and Karl Radek and others had been loyal to the Communist Party for many years, since 1903, probably 1905, and they could not stand the situation where they were outside the party, so they rejoined it. But both of them led a rather awful life inside the party. Priebus was in constant dispute, constant trouble. And I read fairly recently that, in fact, in the early 30s, he met secretly with Trotsky, which of course indicates something. In regard to Karl Radek, his famous quip was, "Can one build socialism in one country?" And Radek had an official post, I've now forgotten what it was. Can one build socialism in one country? Of course one can, but God help that country. That's what he became known for, at least among some people. I was told that by somebody who visited Russia at that time, who came across it. But that exposes the joke, exposes the nature of the system itself, the failure of the system, the permanent failure of the system. It never succeeded. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillel. Some interesting ideas there. I've got three comrades who want to come in. Just remind comrades to use the raise hand function, or if you haven't got one, the question and answer, and we'll try and bring you in. Okay, so the first comrade to come in is Tony Greenstein, I think.
Thank you. Can you all hear me, he says?
Yes, I can hear you, Tony, yeah.
Yeah.
We can't really see you though, because you're staring off the screen.
You can see me now, I believe.
Yes.
Okay, I was just going to try and see. I put the questions up, so let me. No. Okay, for some reason I can't. Was it, Hillel, was it all inevitable that given the isolation of the Soviet Union, that there was really nothing much that could be done, that regardless of who was at the helm, whether it was Stalin as general secretary or Trotsky or whoever, the Soviet Union would have gone the same way? Or was it possible for a party that was conscious of itself and its own isolation to bide its time until conditions were more favorable, for example, in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and then to be able to take advantage of that revolutionary wave? And I know it's an absolutely, it's not totally germane to the debate, but you're talking about Stalinism. So I thought I'd throw in this question, and you may or may not be able to answer it. The third period was in Germany was a result, in essence, of the Soviet Union's diktat, namely that social democracy was social fascism. Do you believe that one of the calculations for that turn, describing social democracy, the SPD, as social fascist, was a desire on Stalin's part to actually see Hitler take power as a way of dividing his adversaries in the West? I know it's slightly off topic, but I thought I'd take advantage of you being here to throw it in.
Sorry, Tony, you had another question as well about the coup issue.
Yes, it really follows from that. But yes, I'll make it more specific. Supposing Trotsky had accepted the offer of a coup and it had succeeded, do you think Trotsky would have been able to break out of the circle or the circumstances in which the Soviet Union had found itself? And could the Soviet Union have taken a different path than the one it did?
Okay, should I answer?
Okay, thanks, Tony. I think the next comrade is Anthony. Sorry,
Kevin, I think Hillel was going to reply.
Okay, right, fine. Yeah, come back, Hillel, if you want. Yeah.
Sorry, Hillel, did you want to come back straight away?
Yeah.
Or do you, yeah.
Yes, I'd rather, I'll forget otherwise. Yes, that's a very good question. Was it inevitable? No, I don't think it was. But it was not anticipated. What was expected, and remember, was that there would be a revolution in the West. Remember, there was a revolution in Hungary. In fact, there was a revolution in southern Germany, and Germany could have gone. So in that sense, the Bolsheviks were right in taking power and expecting things to change in the West. But it didn't immediately. It wasn't it wasn't inevitable that there would not be a revolution in Germany either. If one looks at it, and I'll answer the last part of that question at the same time. I said, Antonio Vorosenko did offer Trotsky the possibility of taking power. Would it have worked? I think it would have worked. I don't see why it shouldn't have. What couldn't have happened was that he would have been able to build socialism. But what he could have done was survive, could have tried to industrialize in a sensible way, and tried to develop an understanding of socialism within the population. At the very least, what would then have happened would have been a situation which was one in which people were better off and where there was a possibility of helping socialism in other parts of Europe. So in that sense, it wasn't inevitable. And in that sense, I think Trotsky was probably wrong. Because the fact, not that I'm saying that I understand it any better than Trotsky, obviously he did. But the looking back from where we are today, it is now a century since the revolution. And if you think of what the possibility could have been in the development of socialism, in the development of a more adequate society which fewer people were dying early or don't have enough to eat. I think it was quite possible at that time. If they'd had a line, or if they had been possible to put forward or get support for a structure which would have maintained itself for a short period of time in order to help the West, it could definitely have worked. It wasn't inevitable that Hitler would take power in 1933. And as a matter of fact, the Communist Party, if you remember, that was party in Germany in 1930. The one or two states actually had a coalition with the fascists. What came into existence was the negation of the Communist Party, effectively. Consequently, if Trotsky had managed to stop it for a time, it would have been progress. It might have helped. But obviously, you can see why Trotsky did not want to take power. He made it clear too in what he wrote, as I think people know probably, that he didn't want to take power, because if he had, he would have ended up like Stalin. I think that's what he basically said. I don't think he would have, but that's a perfectly reasonable consideration. That's to say, he didn't want to become a dictator. Yeah. I don't think, in that sense, I don't think it was inevitable. The possibility of a revolution outside of the Russian Empire clearly existed. And there was an attempt at revolution. And one can't say that history necessarily went the way it did. I don't think that was true. Yeah.
Okay, next comrade, Anthony Brain.
Yes, in the last few days, I've been starting to read The Revolution Betrayed. Like Marx did in Capital and the Grandisa explain capitalism and its laws, this law deals with the theory of the degenerated workers' state as a transitional society between capitalism and socialism, and that's applicable to all the workers' states, except for Cuba and Nicaragua, and includes capital has been restored in Kosovo and next East Germany. I think the key contradiction Trotsky worked out was between the economic base which overthrew capitalism and the bureaucratic caste that actually arisen and politically expropriated the working class. I mean, in the new course in 1923, Trotsky said Lenin wanted there's a bureaucrat that was coming in I can't remember, it was in 1920, flooding the party, and then he carried out mass purges to drive them out because he thought they were removing careerists, because obviously they adapt to a revolution and try and get privileges and power out of it. But in 1923, Trotsky ran all the major articles in Pravda in the German Revolution. When the German Revolution was defeated, he was kicked out of Pravda. Lenin, apparently one of the China, Lenin warned about the red bureaucracy, it may have been poison. I think we have to defend the gains of the worker state. It's not just an historical question, because, for example, when there's cutbacks in the bureaucracy pillage, there's a sharing of power to capitalists like Yeltsin in Eastern Europe. There's big setbacks. When it shifts, the bureaucracy shifts and puts more money into the nationalized industries, or increases benefits, that's an improvement. But I think the thing is, Trotsky said the planned economy went forward, but had to catch up with the capitalist technique. Now China has gone, although it's already on a lower base than Indian capitalism after the worker state was set up, and the Soviet Union is much more advanced in technique, and that's why it's called the modern economy, still a bureaucratic task. And the main difference is between the non-capitalist mode of production and the bourgeois norms of distribution, for example, the pillaging that goes on. But that's why they don't always coordinate with the planned economy, and that's why they have to be overthrown with political revolution. But there are capitalist layers. But look, I've learned the final point, because this is very important with Chapmanism, which saw capitalism and restoration being better than the bureaucratized worker state. Look at the state of Eastern Europe with the capitalist inroads. In the 1930s, you had mass unemployment in the capitalist world. The Soviet Union had full employment, pensions and wages. When the bureaucracy pillaged and Eastern Europe so undermined after the failure of the political revolution, look at the setback. Look at the setback on Yeltsin. Look what Navalny's trying to do, get worse than Yeltsin. And that's what they're trying to do, is privatize and cause mass misery. So they seem to defend, but also to overthrow the bureaucracy on that social foundation. I think that's very important to remember. And if Poland's got the natural resources in Kosovo, but look at the mass unemployment there is there.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Would you like to respond, Hillel?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear most of that. Can I go out and come back and increase the sound?
No, yeah, I mean, I think what the comrade was asking about was the sort of successes of the planned economy. And he was talking in particular about the way that Trotskyists would defend those aspects of the planned economy. And I think he was really making a sort of a statement along those lines. I just wondered how you would regard Stalinism as something which had taken the economy and society forward, or do you think that in fact it was retrogressive? I think that's what the comrade was asking, Hillel.
Chapmanism.
I don't think I've got any choice. Can I go out and come back in again?
Okay, Tina, you're doing the technical.
I think we can take maybe a couple of more contributions, and perhaps you understand them better. I don't think it's a technical issue.
Okay. Okay, I'll bring in Matthew Jones now, please.
Okay.
My comrades, right. I'll try and speak a little louder then, and slightly slower, and hopefully people can hear. Well, I think that in terms of the Stalinist bureaucracy, I don't agree with much of what's just been said. I don't think that the bureaucracy actually moved things in a positive direction at all. I mean, if we look at it, I mean, there are various things which we have to say is the sort of hallmarks of it. One, of course, is the slaughter of the revolutionary generation, which of course is extremely important for in terms of Marxism itself, and of course any future revolutions. The fact that you had a generation of people that actually been through a series of revolutions and succeeded in the last one in Russia was incredibly important. And of course, the fact that the bureaucracy then wiped these people out is an enormous criminal act. I think the other thing you have to say is in terms of its extreme vacillation. I mean, the hallmark of the Stalinist bureaucracy, of course, is it went from one pole to the other, and its first thing was to say, well, it was of the right, it was going to concede to the peasantry, it didn't want to industrialize, and then of course it went exactly the opposite way and said, okay, we'll go for this mad industrialization, of course, and create industry as Rakovsky points out, much of which the output of much of which was rubbish, unusable. This also applies in terms of its movement internationally. I mean, the thing is, first of all, obviously you have the first 4 congresses of the Comintern, in which you do have a debate, the serious debate, about how you move the revolution forward. Then you have a position in which people essentially are being crushed down, and there is no, the debate is crushed out. And then the bureaucracy moves from one position to the other. First of all, adapting to the trade union bureaucracy, as they did in the general strike in this country. Then, of course, going to the third period, of course, again, nonsense, and winding up, as Hillel's pointed out, allying themselves with the very fascists they were supposed to be fighting, rather than actually, attempting to take the social democratic workers with them to fight the fascists. I mean, it's a series of crimes, and under conditions in which, obviously, capitalism itself is seriously unstable. And it's actually that Stalinism itself is responsible for the stabilization of capitalism after World War II, quite clearly so. So in those terms, an enormous obstacle to the workers' movement and to the liberation of humanity. And finally, I think also, which I think Hillel's gone into in some detail, is its actual perversion of Marxism. Both of Marxism in terms of its understanding of the world, and in terms of how precisely the working class should organize itself, not as sort of mini dictatorships and bureaucracies, but as real parties. And this is the problem. This is the nature of the organizations we've been left with, most of which have been pretty horrible, and are actually in many cases quite repulsive. So I mean, in those terms, I think the balance sheet on Stalinism is almost entirely negative, and we should draw it that way. Thanks.
Hillel, would you like to respond to Matthew's comment?
Well, I agree with him. I think most people don't realize that the Soviet Union, as it became, let's say, once Stalin was in power, did not introduce a new system. Next time I'll explain the nature of the system that came into being. And I spent most of my life doing that, actually. But I'll explain it. And the point of the nature of that system is that it's neither capitalism nor socialism, nor is it anything else. It's not really a system. It's internally contradictory to a point that you can't use the word contradiction as you use in capitalism. So that it's not surprising that when they tried to reform, the result was a mess and the thing vanished. It never constituted a new system. Well, you wouldn't expect there to be some completely new system, neither capitalism nor socialism. The idea that some form of state capitalism is simply nonsense. It wasn't capitalist, straightforwardly. So it was a form of its own kind. Just as if we look at China today, now they're calling it state capitalist, and it's closer to that because something like 60 to 80% of the urban economy is private. So it makes some sort of sense. But the Soviet Union was never like that. And when they were building it in the 20s and 30s, and it wasn't anywhere near like that. So it never had a hope of actually existing. One couldn't imagine a society as internally not just contradictory, but opposite to itself at all times.
Okay, thanks. Pamela Blakelock, next comrade.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so my first comment. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, no, I can hear you, but I've got to remark that the people couldn't hear me.
I could hear you.
Well, is there some? I can.
No, it's all good. It's all good. We can hear. Everybody can hear.
I just want to, if I could come out of the whatever the program, to come into it, and I came back again, I could increase the power of. Can I do that?
It's actually fine, Hillel. I think people just might have to turn up their volume. It's fine. I can hear you absolutely fine. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Okay, so my first, my first comment and question is the critique made by Simon Peroni that the Bolsheviks were too aggressive maybe towards the other political tendencies which were on the left, and that and he says, well, maybe they were paranoid and maybe you can understand this, but if they had been more amenable to a bit more of a coalition on the left, that would have helped them. Secondly, I agree, I think, with Matthew Jones and you on the analysis of the development of the revolutionary situation at that time. And one of the things which I don't know about is why the Weekly Worker and the CPGB critique Trotsky so much. They came out of the Communist Party, I think, to fight because they wanted to fight Stalinism, but they don't seem to adhere particularly to Trotsky. And so my last one was, so I joined the Socialist Labour League in 1968 and saw the degeneration of the WRP until 1985. And my view on it was that it adopted Stalinist methods in the leadership of the party in relation to putting the ends above means, eschewing any socialist morality in the sense of valuing people and valuing members, and a very bureaucratic dictatorship type and paranoid organizational setup. So I don't know if you can comment on any of those, please, Hillel. Thank you.
Okay, Hillel, if you'd like to respond.
Yes. Yes, the title of the session is Stalinism, and it was, and attached to it is the dates of the Soviet Union. But it's worthwhile discussing Stalinism itself as a whole and as applied throughout the world, which means the various Stalinist parties, which is implied in what has been said. And it is true that the communist parties which came into existence in the rest of the world were Stalinist parties in two senses. Stalinist in the sense that they owed allegiance to the Soviet Union, but they were also Stalinist in their methods and their forms. And I think the people who were in it, ordinary people who were in it, or those who were not deriving their income from it anyway, didn't really know what they were doing. So, anyway, the point is that I'm trying to get to is that Stalinism was a particular and temporary economic form, political economic form, which came into existence in the Soviet Union and in a number of other countries. But it also applied to the communist parties in general. And what's implied here is that up to a point, it kind of was absorbed in the left, which was not Stalinist, which is probably true. I think that's to say, if one has a genuine socialist organization, it ought to be as democratic as possible. The problem, of course, with that is that it then splits. But the time may simply be such that it's very difficult for that not to happen. I don't know, but it's true that the success or the relative success of the Stalinist parties down to sometime in the late 70s made it difficult for the left in general not to follow the same kind of dictatorial pattern which was maintained by those communist parties. If you think of the British Communist Party, then it's clear that its leaders remained there for many years, from the 20s onwards. And that it followed the Soviet Union as much as was possible. So yes.
Okay, Steve Freeman.
Hi there, Hillel. I got 3 points really, I think, or 3 observations, let's put it like that. So the first one is that this is all about counter-revolution. That if we didn't call it Stalinism, we could call it counter-revolution. The whole process of counter-revolution, where Cromwell, of course, was a revolutionary. He created the New Model Army, overthrew Charles, and then in 1649 he became a counter-revolutionary. So often the leaders of revolutions even become counter-revolutionaries. I wouldn't put Stalin as necessarily the leader of the Russian Revolution, but nevertheless, it comes from within. So counter-revolution is not inevitable, but once it's got legs, it's very difficult to turn the tide back again. So the question is, when did it get legs? So I think one aspect is one you've already said. For socialism to have succeeded, it would have had to have been a European revolution. And so therefore, crucially, Germany was crucial to that. And the revolution in Germany was defeated in 1923. So 1923 was a crucial point. But because of the unstable nature of global capitalism, world capitalism at that time, a revolutionary situation rose in Germany from after 1928 into the early 1930s, 1930 to 33. So the revolution the whole thing could have turned around in Germany if Hitler hadn't won, hadn't come to power. So in a way, Stalinism and Hitler did a joint counter-revolutionary effort in 1930 to 33. So that's one aspect, the European aspect. Russia was lost in Germany. Germany was a key to the whole situation. Second point, I think, is, however, is that you have to look at counter-revolution inside the Soviet Union. And that kind of goes back to Tony's point. When did the working class lose power in Russia? Now, you've got to address that. In other words, when was democracy lost in Russia? Now, I don't think it was lost through the Civil War, because in November 1920, the Bolsheviks triumphed. It was possible that democracy could have been revived or rebuilt in Russia. And so the problem they got in Russia was in early 1921, the defeat of Kronstadt, the Kronstadt rebellion, and the attack on party democracy in I forget which party congress it was, also in March 1921. It was that whole event in early 1921 when democracy was lost. And at that point, without democracy, without democracy or without Germany, the revolution was not going to succeed, it seems to me. Trotsky was therefore a victim of 1921, even though he participated in those events himself. The choice between a democratic approach or a bureaucratic approach, and it was bureaucratic socialism, so-called socialism, that triumphed, or socialism in one country. But of course, it wasn't socialism, could never have been socialism. It's a triumph of bureaucracy over democracy. That's what happened in the early 1920s. So I think the problem with the Trotskyist movement and obviously the Stalinists as well, they've never come to terms with what happened in early 1921, never really faced up to that, about the problems that happened as a result of Kronstadt, the failure of Kronstadt and all the rest of it, and the defeat of Kronstadt. Never recovered from 1921. It was downhill all the way after that. And then my last point is that the industrialization of the 1930s, it did succeed in one way. I agree with the way you've described it, but if it hadn't succeeded, the Soviet Union could not have fought successfully during the Second World War. They did succeed in building dams and roads and factories, and especially tanks and weapons in that 10-year period, maybe. But of course, on the basis of the alienation of the working class, massive poverty, starvation, slavery, a horrendous cost to the working class, the Soviet managed to build sufficient industry to be able to actually win the Second World War in some respects. I doesn't disagree with anything you said about it, Hillel. It was inefficient, corrupt, bureaucratic, and all those other things. So I think that, so those 3 points. Well, 3 points are Europe and Germany. Secondly, the defeat of democracy inside Russia, 1921. And thirdly, that the counter-revolution created the industrialization of Russia and by the enslavement of the working class during the 1930s. So it's counter-revolution, counter-revolution, counter-revolution. Kronstadt, Germany, and the industrialization process.
Thanks, Steve. Hillel?
Okay. Yeah, so that's a fair point. In relation to Germany, it's true that if in 1929, when the Great Depression occurred, there had been a left-wing force in Russia, a genuine left-wing force, the world would be very different. But it didn't exist. The last thing that Stalin wanted was in fact a revolution outside of Russia, which would effectively dominate them against him. Germany by that time had already been dealt with, as it were, in the sense that the Communist Party in Germany was Stalinized. It wasn't perhaps 100% Stalinized, but it was Stalinized. If you go through the history of what happened to the German Communist Party, you can see that. Of course, if Russia weren't what it was, then Germany might not have been, the German Communist Party might not have been Stalinized. So, but as it stood, it's hard to know what could have happened. It's certainly true that the world was more unstable in that period after the Great Depression, during the Great Depression. In a second point that was made is that Kronstadt, that's to say the sending of troops to defeat the people, the sailors, etc., in Kronstadt, who were basically anarchists, shows that it wasn't democratic. Well, it wasn't democratic. It wasn't democratic from the beginning, except in a very general sense that the formation of the Communist Party did relate a considerable number of members of the Air Force, of the military, and they were supported by a substantial section of the urban working class, there's no question of that as well. But they, what was it, about 26% of the peasantry when the vote took place in December 1917 supported the Bolsheviks. So depends what you mean by democracy. But if by democracy you mean what would have happened had there been a direct vote in the population, it would depend when it actually happened. But if you take what did happen, that's to say the voting which took place for the parliament, which was introduced at the beginning of 1918, there's no question that the majority did not vote for the Bolshevik Party. The majority, after all, were peasants, and only the peasants without land would have actually directly voted for the Bolshevik Party. So, in effect, the Bolshevik Party had taken power with the support quite clearly in Moscow, Leningrad, etc. But in most of the country, I'm not certain they had even heard of Bolsheviks. So it wasn't. It depends how you define the word democratic. I think one has to be very careful with it, because one can ask the question, is Britain democratic? And you have a whole series of reasons why it could be much more democratic than it is. And undoubtedly. So it becomes a question with quite a few answers which lead to different results if one raises the question of democracy in that period. But why take Kronstadt? Kronstadt was a small part of what was happening. By 1921, the Civil War had been raging for 4 years. You remember, something like 7 million people died in the Civil War. A considerable proportion of the left died in that Civil War. A considerable portion of its leadership died in that Civil War. So it's not surprising that you would get a particular section who were basically tired of the Civil War, or thought that there wasn't sufficient democracy, or whatever. But by 1921, it was a very different situation from when they had taken power. And the question of the Bolsheviks was, should they continue in a situation where they were in an undemocratic position? If you judge by how the population voted at various points, then they were undoubtedly undemocratic. But that's not the only definition one has to consider overall. The aim of the Bolsheviks was to make a democratic society. I don't think anybody accuses Trotsky or Lenin of not wanting to have a genuinely, fully democratic society. And they were in power at that point. I'm not at all certain that anarchists are necessarily democratic. It may depend on the anarchist. The third point that was raised was the question of the Second World War and the Soviet Union. It is true that if one looks at the situation, if we analyze what is happening in these periods, then it's highly complex. And what one's talking about is a series of interrelationships which interact and form a new entity, as it were, and that itself does the same again and again. What I'm describing is an aspect of dialectics. That is true. That is necessarily true. So that we can't make a blanket observation into some absolute statement about what was happening as to where it fits into a question of democracy or not democracy, or moving the world forward or not. It's impossible to do that. I think the fundamentals of this, I was going to discuss it next time, lie in the question of the transition period. And the point that, of course, was made right at the beginning of the revolution in 1917, that the world had entered a transition period to socialism. But that transition period has continued. We live in a transition period. It was a transition period then. Now, transition period, the interactions which I'm talking about are considerable and are difficult to analyze precisely because of the constant interaction which is occurring and the formation of something new, which is also occurring. At the same time, what we have to look for is the crucial forces which are playing the critical role in moving the world forward. It's not an easy discussion, as it were, but that is, I think, the basis of, ought to be, or is the basis of Marxism in studying the present time. So if we look at it today, if we look at Britain today, is it democratic? Well, I've already raised the question. In one sense, of course, it is. At the same time, is it the same as it was in October 1917? I say that because the vote was extended a few months later. Remember, up to then, in Britain, no women had the vote. 40%, at least 40% of men didn't have the vote. So what do we consider the nature of the parliament before that period? And after all, women didn't have the full vote until 1928, which was granted by the Conservatives. So before 1928, it wasn't democratic. Democracy is new, effectively, for the world. And I think we have to understand it in those terms, the terms of a movement which is occurring, which is a complex movement occurring with constant interactions and interpenetration, forming new entities which interrelate, which we have to try and understand where it's actually going. So in other words, yes, of course I agree that the Soviet Union played a particular role during the war, and that role, the negative aspect of it was due to Stalinism. The positive aspect is due to the continuing transition showing itself willy-nilly. Okay.
Thanks, Hillel. Last two comrades to come in, and then I've got a number of questions in the box, which I'll just read out at the end. So Ian Spencer, if you'd like to come in now, comrade.
Good evening, comrades. So lovely to see most of you again. The thing I wanted to ask really was about the abiding significance of Stalinism today. In common with a whole bunch of other people, I rejoined the Labour Party. I was a 3-quid Corbynista, in the hope that it might lead to something interesting. But what we've seen, of course, with Comrade Corbyn, despite the fact that on a personal level, he's one of the nicest people you could ever meet, he is predominantly influenced by Stalinism. How do we explain the complete failure of the working class to act as a class? Is it that we have gone through such a dark, dark period and we just have to wait? See, I find it so interesting. On the one hand, we have Brexit. So the British working class, in its time-honoured fashion, has decided to be nationalist rather than internationalist. I could understand it for all sorts of reasons. I'm not a great fan of the European Union, but naturally I would have voted to remain in the European Union. The sooner we're away with all states, the better. On the other hand, worldwide, we've got people showing solidarity with Palestine. And it's quite interesting, of course, that, you know, with regard to South Africa. I don't think many people really there wasn't much international solidarity until after Sharpeville. And is it just the case that Israel has become so heinous, so violent, so despicable, and there's a kind of reflection of what's going on in Britain, the United States, and everything else, where we're moving into more and more authoritarian regimes? I will not use the term fascism, but throughout all of that, the thing that I find so hard to comprehend is this despicable history of Stalinism, that it continues to exert an influence. Are we to explain that just in terms of the inherent nationalism of British people? I mean, I take it as read that Stalinism and nationalism are tied hand and foot. So why can we not get to a situation where the proletariat cannot seem to be a class? Is there a political economic explanation for this? I've racked my brains, such as they are, and I just can't understand it. And I can't understand why anybody would support a Stalinist party under any circumstances. And that means even people like myself who think, well, perhaps Corbyn could have brought us somewhere closer to a place where the working class could unite as a class and achieve their own liberation. It's just a simple question. Thank you.
Well, Ian, I wouldn't say it was simple. Okay, Hillel, if you'd like to respond.
Okay. Am I okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. Right. Yes, well, I agree, of course, that Stalinism has continued to play an important role, and it's clear that Corbyn came from that kind of background. It's very clear. However, if one looks at the working class in Britain, for someone like myself, who came from South Africa, even if it was 60 years ago, it's not difficult to answer your question, but it wouldn't be one that you'd be enjoy, as it were. When we used to discuss the matter in relation to Britain and the British Empire in relation to its colonies, and then its ex-colonies like South Africa, and we then asked the question of what the working class was doing, and nothing. So I think it was just generally accepted that the working class in the developed countries were bought off. That is the doctrine that I received as a young socialist. Well, I wouldn't want to go that far, and I'd argue the other way around now, that as Britain declines as a global competitor, there is a shift to the left. But I don't think you should ignore the particular role that Britain has played in the world economy. It was the major controller of the world economy before the Second World War. And even today, its role is considerable, and its investments in various parts of the world such that there's a considerable surplus flowing to Britain. It's not like the United States, where it's very much bigger, of course, but it's still there. If you want, I could probably go through a few examples. But what that has meant is not necessarily that the sum is enormous, but that it's enough to take the edge off the situation within the class structure of Britain. I think that's part of the reason. It's not just that the salaries may be a bit higher. It is also that people can leave Britain and go to the former colonies like Canada and South Africa as they used to. The United States is still, or they could until recently. Australia, etc., etc. So it's not surprising, I think, if you start to go through it, why there be less militancy in Britain than there might be in, let us say, South Africa or in various other countries. At the same time, of course, one could try and make an argument that the left could have gone further than it has. That might be true. I don't know, but that could be the only other explanation. I wouldn't be quite as pessimistic as Ian appears to be. I think the world has reached a point, and Britain has reached a point where that particular position is beginning to fade. That a section of the working class who had lost employment or were in considerably worse conditions voted the Conservative Party is not surprising when you have a Labour Party which is useless, where the change would have to come at a deeper level. We would need to have a genuine socialist party, not a Labour Party, which is a little different from the Conservative Party, which today could just as well join the Conservative Party. You wouldn't know the difference. So I don't find it surprising that that is the case, but there's another aspect which is also true. If you look at the United States, I've quoted this before, but I don't think everybody realizes. If you look at the United States, the proportion of the population who are manual workers is below 29%. In other words, the vast majority of workers are white-collar workers. Fairly high proportion of them have a higher education. Something like half the age group in the United States are going through the university. So when we're talking about working class, we must be talking of them. They are the majority. In fact, as I understand it, if you actually look at the votes in the United States, then what you see is that the middle class, so-called, because that's what it's called, even though they are in Marxist terms workers, the middle class is divided between those with relatively low salaries, those with higher salaries, who are in positions of control or have jobs which are much better paid. And the better paid tend to vote for Trump. That's not surprising. What that I think means is that if you look at the working class in the sense of those who are manual workers today, then you're not going to get the kind of result which you did get 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. Because the majority of workers are not manual workers today in Britain either. But what you had, of course, in reference to Ian's point, what you really had in Britain with the last election, apart from the various ways in which Boris Johnson managed to succeed, was also a situation where a proportion of the workforce are without jobs or with very poor jobs as compared to previously. And when the alternative is of the kind that I'm talking about, that's say at least half the jobs or possibly the majority of jobs are white collar jobs, where this section of the working class who have are manual workers but can't get jobs and are relatively unskilled. It's not surprising they would go to where they could get a more immediate result. That is, it's understandable. That's the way it would go. And it does mean that when we look at the structures of what exists, it isn't as simple as it might appear, but it is simple in the simple sense that there's a working class and there's a ruling class. But there are sections of the working class who are far better off and are not being catered for, even really by the parties which are supporting him, like the Labour Party, which is totally useless. And it's totally surprising. It's totally unsurprising that that if people wanted to have a higher standard of living, they might, in desperation, then vote for a party which claimed it could do better.
Okay, the last comrade from the floor is Sandy McBurney, and then I've got a few questions in the question box. Okay, Sandy.
Hi, comrades. The first question I'd like to put really is, has Stalinism a future? Really, that would be one of the things that we would have to discuss. We know it had a past. We know how terrible the past is, and it's really a stain on the socialist movement and the consciousness of the working class of the world. What happened in terms of Stalinism and the type of society that was created in the Soviet Union. But there's obviously it's been reproduced in maybe different forms, but if you look at China, if you look at North Korea, if you look at Cuba, there are some similarities that we could refer to an international Stalinist movement. And it's really, is that a danger for the future? Is there a danger that type of counter-revolutionary anti-working class movement within the working class can be reproduced? Obviously, most of us look at being unique conditions in Russia in 1917, surrounded by the counter-revolution, very poor country, illiteracy, etc. But could Stalinism be reproduced in the future? And is it something we have to guard against? And is it something that we have to consider in terms of the political project socialists have, emphasising workers' democracy, emphasising the right for different parties to exist and be able to put forward their perspectives to the working class, the promoting the self-activity of the working class in any way we can? That is all counter to Stalinism, and it's something that we have to fight for in the here and now. But it's really, is there a real danger? Because if you look at the labour bureaucracy in Britain, not only in Britain but internationally, you can see that there are certain similarities with the way the Stalinists organised, and very anti-democratic, a suppression of any dissidents if they can. So that's my point. Is Stalinism really as a phenomenon of the past because of the unique circumstances, etc., or is it a real danger for the future? And the last point, obviously, I mean, it's always been my understanding when the Bolsheviks decided to support the working class taking power through the Soviets in 1917, the first thing they discussed was the international situation and what the prospects were for the revolution being extended in Germany, etc. And that was top of the agenda. If they thought there had been no possibility of the revolution extending, they wouldn't have taken power. That's my understanding. So again, when we're looking at the working class internationally, we have to be careful of the working class taking power in small areas where it can be isolated, and again you get the Cuba-style situation, or far worse, the North Korea-style situation. We have to make sure that when the working class moves forward, it's prepared and strong enough that if it takes power, it'll be able to hold power in a democratic form. That's my point. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. Hillel, if you'd like to respond.
Kevin, Ian's got his hand up. Can you see him?
Yeah, but the point is I've got around about 6 or 7 questions.
All right, okay.
I've made a decision just to go with those. I have seen him.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, well, I agree with the overall point. Well, if we look at the fall of Stalin as it actually came into being, Sandy's right in describing the both the backwardness and the poverty of Russia at the time. And of course, the third factor was the civil war and continuous war, which went on. And if you look at China, you get a similar kind of reflection of absolute poverty and desperation. Well, what is it? 50 million people died in China under Mao Zedong in the Great Leap Forward. Well, Sandy asked the question whether it can happen again. Well, of course, it's impossible to know whether it would or wouldn't happen again, but I should think there are a number of reasons why it may not. Firstly, part of the problem, a major part of the problem, was the absolute poverty of the population. In other words, not just that their clothes may be ragged, but they didn't even get enough to eat, whether in China or in Russia. We now live in a world where it's perfectly possible for the world to produce enough for everyone. Obviously, it requires a system which is able to take advantage of it. But the level of production has continued to rise over time. And the production of the instruments of production itself has been considerable. This means that the world can provide for itself in a way it couldn't do before. On top of that, the expansion of the population is beginning to slow down. So I think simply on technical grounds, we can say the possibility of providing for all, for even a government which is not left-wing, might be able to do, or at least do part of, does seem on the cards. In relation to the gloom which would be engendered, I think we should point out that implicit in what I said is the standard of living has risen very considerably. And the means of production have changed for the better in the last 100 years, which is from the time of the Russian Revolution. You look at how far things have advanced. It's very, very considerable, which was, of course, part of the point anyway in taking power, that they thought they could then develop the means of production so that the standard of living of all would be high. Well, that's very possible today, even within capitalism. Not that they would actually go ahead and distribute in that way. Clearly they won't. So I think that is unlikely. There's another factor which is coming to being in the case of the United States. Well, it's not clear what is really going to happen in the United States now, but what Biden has proposed is a complete change for the United States compared with what existed for the last 40 years. He's proposing to go back to the period before, let's say before 1980, before Reagan and Thatcher. Now, it's perfectly possible to do that and for the whole population to be far better off. And I don't know if he's putting it in quite those terms, but he's coming pretty close to that. If you go through the sums that he's pouring in, 6 trillion budget, 2 trillion more than Trump had proposed last time, and 3 trillion he's already introduced. So you're talking of a possibility of a considerable change. Now, I've mentioned it not because the socialism has come, because it hasn't, but because it lays the groundwork for change, for a situation where standard of living can rise. And what effectively is happening is that a section of the ruling class in the United States recognizes that the demand of the population is for a higher standard of living and that they will have to do it. Now, they may not actually end up doing it. Obviously, I can't tell whether Biden is going to get through it. But if you read what Biden is talking about, then that is what he's talking about, which not many people expected. I don't think Biden is a socialist. And I don't think that many people in the Democratic Party are socialist either, although it's got a left wing. But the point being made is that we're not in the same circumstances that we were 100 years ago. It's not, the reason why Biden can do that is because the means of production have gone forward to a degree where it's possible to do, and where it's relatively cheap now to actually raise the standard of living in that way. And that's why it's possible. It's not why they're doing it. They're doing it because they feel threatened at the present time. They are indeed threatened. Whether they could hold, I don't know, but they're effectively making concessions. Whether they'll go through with it, I don't know either, but that is the real situation in the United States today. If you look at the world as a whole, then what we see is a situation for large parts of the third world where they're not able to provide enough for themselves to eat. The situation has got worse. It's not getting better. It's worse in South Africa, of course, but that's a particular example. It's worse in a considerable part of the African continent. And one looks at South America, that can't go on like this. That's to say, the ruling class has to decide what it's going to do with that. Because the logic of that situation, of course, is that you will get movements which move to the left, or perhaps move to the far right as well. But you will get movements of this kind. They will spread themselves, and you could get a genuine left becoming more and more powerful. In relation to the United States, it is critical. The United States is the global power. I think people miss the fact that it is the controlling power. It's not that it's wants to do good throughout the world, but as the controlling power, it has to maintain its control. And it can't maintain its control under those circumstances. It must find a way to actually deal with it, which it knows. And as you notice, the IMF has changed its line, something I never expected to see, where it's no longer, in terms of the loans which is making them under much easier circumstances than before. They're going out of their way to give loans. So now this has arisen not just because of the class struggle, but that is very much part of it. But also because in the last 100 years, the means of production have advanced considerably, and it is possible today to raise the standard of living of the world as a whole. In other words, socialism is clearly possible today. And I'm not pessimistic about its possibilities within a finite time. Whether I'm alive is another question, but within a finite time. Thanks.
Thanks, Hillel. I've just got a couple of questions that came in the question box, and I'll just go through them, and they'll act, I suppose, as a bit of a summing up. One question is about the issue of state capitalism, particularly whether the attacks on the kulaks showed that the Soviet Union was state capitalist. And perhaps then linked to a question which a lot of comrades have been hinting at, whether the role of individuals, whether if Lenin had survived or if Trotsky had taken power. I think you've already dealt with this, but it might be useful just to sum up on those lines. And then also the question of whether carrying out a revolution in a country with a small proletariat, whether there was always going to be a danger of counter-revolution. That's a question there. And then one last question, which I'll just get now a second. Do you think that that Stalinism's influence will, in a sense, just naturally fade, or do you think that it will have a sort of a longer form? So answer as many of those as you wish. Thanks very much.
State capitalism. Yes. Now the term, as you indicated, has been adopted by the right as well. Well, the problem with the term is that it covers a whole series of different forms. I don't think it applied to the Soviet Union. It wasn't capitalist. The fact that it wasn't capitalist didn't make it a nice place, or it didn't make it a socialist place, or etc. But state capitalism simply doesn't deal with the term and deal with the reality. If we look at the country which most obviously would apply to today, it's China, and it's now the common term used by, as indicated, by both the left and the right. In fact, the problem with it is that it's not like the Soviet Union. It does have 60 to 80% of its urban industrialized sector private. It's really private. Not only is it private, but there is very substantial American investment. In spite of all Trump's sanctions, big capital in the United States is investing to a very considerable degree in China. I don't think it helps to call it state capitalism. Yeah. But the term can be used because I don't think it helps because it's not simply a state capitalism. You've got private capitalism, in fact, to a very considerable degree. As I quoted it, and when the investment that you have from the American firms, the American asset buying firms, which is going to a very considerable extent into China. The United States is not state capitalist in those terms. So I don't know. I don't see any objection to using the word if you do, but then you have to make allowances for the aspects in which it isn't state capitalist, it's private capital. What is the number? I think they talk of something like 600 billionaires or something in China. Exactly what it is more complex. It's a very interesting subject, though, to go into. The second question is the role of individuals. Yes, clearly individuals can play a very important role. In fact, a critical role at certain points of history. I think that is true. And it might have been possible, which is what has been said in the case that I cited, it might have been possible that if Trotsky had seized power in 1923, then the world would be very different. That is very possible, I think. Yes, but it would require an extraordinary individual to actually take power and not get tempted by the situation. But it clearly might have been possible. I think it is true, at least, that if Trotsky had taken power, he wouldn't have had the purges. You wouldn't have had, of course, the whole movement from 1923 onwards. You'd have a different form of industrialization. But what would have resulted from that, I don't know. Sorry, I've forgotten what the third question was. If there was no proletariat, or
yeah, the question was whether given that there was a very small proletariat, was it inevitable that the revolution would be overthrown?
Oh, I think it was inevitable if it had to last by itself and it didn't make any attempts to join with other revolutions. Yes, if it couldn't remain by itself in a world which had not moved to the left. In other words, 100 years later or 50 years later, if it hadn't had any assistance, I think it would have been overcome. Yes. Well, that's in part the social one country is really impossible. It's not a question of taking particular measures which can counter it. You can't counter the fact that the world is against you, and the world is expecting you to react to the market system. You have to adapt to a market system in some way or other if the rest of the world is based on a market. You can hold out for a time doing various things, but you can't hold out forever. I think that is true. In relation to Stalinism, I'll try and go into it further, but I think people are quite right in bringing out the various aspects of it. It's clear it's played a very important role as a particular ideology, although one can't say it's the ruling class ideology, it's an assistant to that ruling class ideology. It has helped it. But in principle, if we are talking about a movement towards the left, Stalinism would have to be dying. And if the standard of living can rise, and if there is a definite shift to the left, if people understand to a greater degree what Stalinism is, I think it's possible that not be repeated.
Okay, thanks very much, Hillel. You've worked very hard this evening. Questions coming from all directions. We've ranged far and wide, and we've still got next week to come. So there's a lot of stuff still to go over. I'd like to thank you very much. I've learned a lot this evening. I'm sure other comrades have as well.